In the late 1990s, a small-town police officer named Eric Connolly in Montana thought he'd seen it all: the drunk brawls, the occasional car theft, even some violent disputes. But nothing had prepared him for the case that would haunt his dreams. It was an early October evening when the first call came in. A woman reported hearing screams from an abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The place had been vacant for years, belonging once to the Truesdale family, who'd mysteriously vanished almost a decade earlier. Eric knew the rumors around town: stories of the house being cursed, neighbors swearing they saw lights in the windows and shadows moving across the property. But Eric chalked it up to superstition. That night, though, he was about to learn how real fear could be. Eric drove out to the old Truesdale place alone, radio static filling the silence as he drove down the long, winding dirt road. The house loomed in the distance, a tall, crumbling silhouette against the twilight sky. As he pulled up, he noticed the oddest thing: a flickering light in one of the upper windows. Swallowing his nerves, he radioed in his location and stepped out of his cruiser, flashlight in hand. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking ominously as he pushed it open further. The air was stale and reeked of rot, like something decaying just beneath the floorboards. Inside, dust coated every surface, and Eric's footsteps echoed in the empty rooms. But the silence didn't last long. Just as he reached the base of the staircase, he heard it, a faint but distinct sound. Crying. He shone his flashlight up the stairs. The sobbing grew louder as he ascended, now accompanied by the muffled sound of voices, like a distorted conversation. Eric's skin prickled as he slowly climbed the stairs, his heart pounding harder with each step. When he reached the landing, he followed the noise down a narrow hallway leading to the bedroom with the flickering light. With his flashlight still raised, Eric carefully pushed open the door. The room was empty, save for a single candle in the corner, its flame weak and wavering. Yet the sobbing continued, louder now, though there was no one there. And then the voices stopped. Suddenly, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, but something compelled him to stay. He scanned the room, taking in the broken dresser, the peeling wallpaper, and a strange rust-colored stain on the floor. It looked too fresh to be from years ago. The radio at his hip crackled to life, making him jump. But instead of the dispatcher's voice, all he heard was a strange whisper, something he couldn't quite make out. He leaned in closer, trying to decipher the words. It was then that he realized it wasn't just one voice. It was many, overlapping, frantic and insistent, and then all at once they were screaming. Eric's heart froze as he felt a chill wrap around him, a sensation like ice crawling up his spine. Desperate to escape, he turned to the door, but it slammed shut in his face with a deafening bang. He yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Then, in the dim candlelight, he saw a shadow moving across the wall. It was twisted, unnatural, and crawling like it had too many limbs. As he watched in horror, the shadow seemed to grow larger, stretching across the walls and ceiling, forming grotesque shapes that writhed and pulsed. And then, in one horrifying moment, it began to take form. A woman's face emerged from the darkness, hollow-eyed, her mouth stretched wide in a silent scream. Behind her, dozens of other faces appeared, each one twisted in agony. Eric's mind screamed at him to look away, but he couldn't move. Suddenly he heard a voice behind him, clear and unmistakable. "Help! Us!" The faces began to fade, dissolving back into the shadow, but not before he saw something horrifyingly familiar. His own face, frozen in fear, appearing among the others. With a surge of adrenaline, Eric threw his shoulder against the door. It burst open, and he stumbled back into the hallway, gasping for breath. The candle in the room extinguished, plunging everything into darkness. He fumbled for his flashlight and bolted down the stairs, the unseen voices still whispering around him, growing louder with each step. When he finally burst out into the night air, he nearly collapsed from relief. But the silence that greeted him was somehow worse. His cruiser, which he'd parked right in front of the house, was gone. In its place were deep, dark tire marks leading away from the property, almost as if something had dragged it off. Eric radioed for backup, his voice shaking, but there was only static. His calls went unanswered. Frantically, he searched his surroundings, but the quiet felt impenetrable, like the house itself was absorbing all sound. As he backed away from the house, he noticed something strange in the dirt. Footprints, dozens of them, leading up to the house and circling it. They looked fresh, but as he inspected closer, he saw they weren't the prints of regular shoes. They were small, bare footprints like those of children, and they were joined by something else. Claw marks that gouged deep into the earth, trailing off into the woods. By the time Eric finally made it back to town, he was shaken, and his report was dismissed as a delusion brought on by stress. The Trussdale house was fenced off, marked as unsafe, and the sheriff's department put the incident out of mind. But Eric knew what he'd seen, and in the years that followed, he could never shake the memory. The house was silent for nearly 2 decades, but a new report surfaced recently. Another scream heard in the dead of night, another figure seen flickering at the window. This time, the report didn't make it to the news. The sheriff's department had learned from Eric's case, learned to keep these things quiet. But when they sent a rookie officer to check it out, he never came back. All they found was his car, doors open, the engine still running. And in the dust on the passenger seat was a single child-sized handprint smeared in something dark. It was early winter when Officer Carla Reyes got a call about a break-in at the Holloway family home, a sprawling, isolated property in rural Colorado. It was the kind of house that neighbors whispered about. A huge, decaying mansion, vacant since the 1960s, when the entire Holloway family had perished in a fire. People in town avoided it. They claimed they'd seen lights flickering at odd hours, strange figures in the windows, and once or twice even heard the faint laughter of children. Carla didn't believe in ghosts, but a part of her had always wondered about the old Holloway house. And now, just as the first snow of the year was beginning to fall, she was about to find out. When Carla arrived, she found the front door forced open, hinges splintered like they'd been pried apart by something strong. Her flashlight illuminated the grand entrance hall, which stretched far ahead into pitch darkness. The air was thick with dust, and the strange, sweet smell of old wood burnt and charred in places. She radioed dispatch, confirming her arrival, but the connection crackled, fading in and out. Then came a voice on the other end, barely audible, distant, like a child's voice whispering, "Help me." "Dispatch? Hello?" she called, but all she got in return was static. As she stepped inside, the door creaked shut behind her with a loud bang, locking itself. Carla twisted the knob, but it wouldn't budge. She sighed and proceeded to check the main hall, chalking it up to an old warped door. Her flashlight beam swung across the peeling wallpaper, catching glimpses of faded portraits on the wall. Stern men in suits, women in old-fashioned dresses, and children. Too many children, all with wide, vacant eyes staring directly ahead. Suddenly, Carla heard the soft patter of footsteps above her. She gripped her flashlight tightly and called out, "This is the police! Come down now!" But there was no response, just those little footsteps running from one end of the house to the other. She debated calling for backup, but she was determined to do this on her own. She took a deep breath and climbed the grand staircase, her hand brushing the railing. It felt oddly warm, like someone had just held it. When she reached the top, the footsteps stopped. She swept her flashlight around the corridor. The wallpaper was peeling, with dark red streaks staining the fabric in thick, irregular lines. It didn't look like paint. The whole place had an uncomfortable weight to it, like she'd stepped into another time entirely. She pushed open the first door on her left, revealing a nursery filled with cribs and rocking chairs, all eerily intact. Dolls with lifeless eyes sat in each crib, propped up as if waiting. Then one of the chairs started to rock slowly on its own, the soft creak breaking the silence. Carla shone her flashlight on the chair, but there was nothing there, just a steady, unsettling rocking. Just as she turned to leave, she heard it again, the whisper, "Help me." But this time, it was coming from right behind her. She spun around, but the nursery was empty. The rocking chair had stopped. Carla shook it off as her nerves getting to her and moved on to the next room, a bedroom with a massive, dusty bed draped in old lace curtains. Just as she shone her light over the bed, she saw something in the far corner, a dark, twisted shadow, hunched over. She blinked, and it was gone. But now, the bed seemed different. The lace curtains looked torn, like someone had frantically clawed at them from the inside. Carla was about to leave when she noticed a faint trail of what looked like dirt, or maybe ash, leading from the bed to a trapdoor in the floor. The wood around it was charred and broken, and a strange, suffocating smell seeped out. Against her better judgment, she knelt down and lifted the trapdoor. The smell hit her immediately. a sickening blend of decay and rot. Shining her flashlight down, she saw a set of rickety stairs leading into the darkness. Her stomach twisted, but she had to see what was down there. Taking a deep breath, she descended the stairs. The basement was pitch black, with only her flashlight cutting through the darkness. As she moved deeper, her footsteps echoed, bouncing off walls that felt strangely close. And then, the walls themselves began to move. She realized with horror that she was surrounded not by walls, but by people, or rather, their remains. Skeletons with scraps of clothing still clinging to them, mouths frozen open in silent screams, hands outstretched as if trying to claw their way out. Dozens of them, packed into the tight space. Some were children, their small, bony hands still gripping each other in terror. A cold wind swept through the room, and Carla heard that whisper again, louder this time. "Help us, please." The voices grew louder, overlapping, desperate. She backed away, her heart pounding, but as she turned to leave, she felt something cold grip her ankle. She looked down to see a skeletal hand reaching out from the dirt, clutching her with an iron grip. Carla screamed, kicking at the hand until it let go, then scrambled up the stairs. As she reached the top, she heard footsteps rushing up the stairs behind her, fast and heavy. She didn't look back. She slammed the trapdoor shut and sprinted down the hall, but something was following her. Its footsteps echoing, growing closer. Just as she reached the staircase, her flashlight flickered and went out. She was plunged into darkness, her own breathing the only sound. But then she felt it, an icy breath on the back of her neck. She bolted down the stairs, her heart racing, barely able to see. When she reached the front door, it wouldn't open. She yanked at the handle, her panic rising as the footsteps grew closer, closer. Finally, with one desperate pull, the door burst open, and Carla stumbled out into the cold night air. She didn't stop running until she reached her patrol car. Only then did she look back at the house. In the window of the nursery, she saw them, figures standing silently, watching her. A man, a woman, and a small child with hollow eyes, gazing down at her with an intensity that chilled her to the bone. Carla reported what she'd seen, but no one believed her. The Holloway house was sealed off, marked as unstable and dangerous, but Carla knew the truth. She knew the souls trapped in that house were still there, waiting, whispering, and reaching for anyone who dared step inside. The town never spoke of it again. But every now and then, someone would claim to hear children laughing in the night, or see a dim light flickering in the old Holloway mansion's windows. And if you walked close enough, some swore they could hear the faintest whisper echoing from deep within. "Help us!" It was well past midnight when Officer James Carter got the call. A series of strange disturbances had been reported at a remote house just off an old back road on the edge of town. There were rumors in the area about that house. Some said it was haunted. Others claimed it was cursed. James had dismissed these stories as nonsense, the result of overactive imaginations in a small, quiet town. He arrived at the property, where an eerie silence blanketed the night. The house itself was a crumbling two-story Victorian, barely illuminated under the moon's weak glow. His radio crackled suddenly as he stepped out of his patrol car, but only static came through. No contact with dispatch. The silence felt heavy, pressing against him. With his flashlight in one hand, he cautiously approached the front door, which hung ajar as if someone had recently entered. As he stepped inside, his footfalls echoed through the empty house, each creak amplified in the stillness. The air was stale, thick with dust and the faint smell of mildew, mixed with something he couldn't place, something metallic and sharp. He called out, announcing his presence, but there was no answer, only silence. The first floor seemed empty, with old furniture draped in sheets and a thin layer of dust covering every surface. He was about to leave when he heard it. A soft, muffled sound, like someone crying, coming from upstairs. It was faint, almost too quiet to hear, but unmistakable. Against his better judgment, he climbed the stairs, his flashlight casting elongated shadows against the peeling wallpaper. As he reached the top, the crying stopped. He shone his light down the hallway, which was lined with closed doors, all with small chip plaques that read Room 1, Room 2, and so on. The house had been a boarding house long ago, but now it felt like a tomb, frozen in time. He approached Room 3, where the sound had come from, and knocked. Silence. He twisted the doorknob, pushing the door open to reveal a small, dark room. It was empty, save for an old bed frame, the mattress long gone, and a cracked mirror hanging on the wall. His flashlight beam caught something odd. A figure in the reflection, standing behind him. He spun around, but the hallway was empty. His heart pounded as he turned back to the mirror. The figure was gone. Just as he was about to leave the room, the door slammed shut, sealing him inside. He twisted the knob, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through him as he pounded on the door, calling for help, though he knew no one was there. Suddenly, he felt a chill, and the crying began again, this time directly behind him. He turned, his flashlight flickering, and saw her. A woman, dressed in a tattered, old-fashioned nightgown, her face pale, eyes hollow and sunken, staring at him with a sorrow that seemed to seep into his very bones. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Her eyes held his as she raised one hand, pointing to something behind him. Terrified, he turned around, his flashlight catching the glint of something metallic, a small, blood-stained knife lying on the floor. The woman's voice came then, barely a whisper. "He won't let me leave." James's hands shook as he backed away from the figure, but she reached out, her cold fingers brushing against his wrist. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's still here." And then, just as suddenly as she'd appeared, she was gone. The door creaked open, releasing him from the room. He stumbled back into the hallway, breathing heavily, his pulse racing. He needed to leave. But as he reached the stairs, he felt a presence behind him, something watching him, following him. The air grew colder, and the smell of decay filled his nostrils. He descended the stairs, each step feeling heavier, like something was pulling him back. Just as he reached the bottom, he heard footsteps coming from behind, slow and heavy, like someone dragging their feet. He didn't dare look back. He pushed the front door open, practically falling out onto the porch. The house loomed behind him, dark and silent once more. He got into his car and drove away, his heart still racing. But just as he was about to turn onto the main road, he glanced in his rearview mirror. In the back seat, he saw her, the woman from the mirror, staring at him with those hollow eyes. He swerved, trying to shake the vision, but she was still there. Her face twisted into an expression of agony as she whispered, "He's here. He's always here." James slammed on the brakes and looked again, but the back seat was empty. He was alone. Shaken and unable to sleep, he returned to the station and looked up the history of the house. The records showed that it had once been owned by a man named Samuel Hargrove, a notoriously violent man who had rented out rooms to boarders in the early 1900s. Over the years, several women had disappeared, last seen at that very house. When the townspeople finally grew suspicious, they went to confront Samuel, but he was gone, and the house was left abandoned. No one knew what had become of him. Some believed he had escaped, while others whispered that his spirit lingered in the house, refusing to let his victims go, even in death. James left the station that night, but he never shook the feeling that someone was watching him, that every shadow hid a pair of hollow eyes. And sometimes, late at night, he'd hear a faint whisper, barely audible, echoing through his mind, "He won't let us leave." It was Officer Daniel Foster's first week on the night shift. His new assignment was patrolling the winding back roads of an area that locals called the Shallows. It was a place shrouded in mystery and rumors, a dense, marshy forest where sunlight barely pierced through during the day, and at night thick fog wrapped around the trees, casting eerie shadows. Daniel had heard stories about the Shallows. The most unsettling was about a string of missing persons cases that seemed to cluster around this area. People claimed they'd seen strange lights in the woods, heard whispers calling out to them, and even witnessed shadowy figures darting between the trees. But as a man of logic, Daniel dismissed these as superstitions meant to scare the townsfolk. On this particular night, just after 3 a.m., Daniel's radio buzzed with a report about a car abandoned on Old Briar Road, a narrow, seldom-used road that ran through the heart of the Shallows. Dispatch mentioned that the vehicle had been found empty, with the driver nowhere in sight. Daniel headed toward the location, the fog growing denser as he neared. He found the car, a rusty, old sedan, parked haphazardly at the edge of the road, its driver's side door wide open. The headlights were off, but the faint glow from the dashboard cast a dim, greenish light inside. When he got out of his cruiser, an unsettling silence surrounded him, and his breath misted in the cold, damp air. He called out, identifying himself, but there was no response. He scanned the car's interior with his flashlight and found a phone on the passenger seat, the screen cracked and flickering, and an empty coffee cup rolling around in the footwell. There were no keys in the ignition, and the driver's seat looked like it had been pushed back hastily, as if someone had gotten out in a hurry. Just as he was about to radio in, he heard a faint rustling sound coming from the woods beside the road. He shone his flashlight into the trees, but the fog swallowed the beam, leaving everything murky and distorted. He called out again, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. That's when he heard it. The unmistakable sound of a child crying, deep in the woods. "Hello?" he called, his voice softer this time. "Is someone out there?" The crying grew louder, but the sound seemed wrong somehow. It was off, like it was playing on a loop, a strange, mechanical rhythm to it. Against every instinct, Daniel felt compelled to investigate. He left his cruiser and stepped off the road, his boots sinking slightly into the damp ground as he entered the woods. The further he went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees seemed to close in on him, their twisted branches reaching out like fingers in the mist. The crying grew louder, pulling him deeper into the forest. It was no longer just a child's voice, it was mixed with other sounds now. Whispers, muttering voices, all barely audible but distinct. They spoke in a language he couldn't understand, a guttural chant that sent chills down his spine. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the crying stopped. The silence that followed was worse. He strained his ears, listening, but all he could hear was his own breath, shallow and rapid. He shone his flashlight around, but every direction looked the same. Fog, shadows, and gnarled trees. Just as he was about to turn back, he noticed something strange. In the mist ahead, he saw faint, flickering lights like tiny orbs hovering in the darkness. They bobbed and swayed, casting a soft glow that didn't seem natural. They moved, almost beckoning him to follow. Without realizing it, he took a step forward, then another. The lights seemed to pull him in, mesmerizing him. But as he got closer, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. A voice in his mind screaming for him to turn back. The lights began to pulse, faster and brighter, illuminating the trees around him. That's when he saw them, figures standing just beyond the trees, half hidden in the shadows. They were people, or at least they had been. Their faces were pale, eyes wide and unseeing, mouths open in silent screams. They stared at him, unmoving, yet somehow alive, their bodies twisted and contorted as if frozen in the midst of agony. He recognized some of them from missing persons reports he'd seen at the station. They had been people who'd vanished from the area, never found. Paralyzed with fear, he watched as the figures began to move, their movements stiff and unnatural, like puppets on strings. Their heads turned to face him, and their eyes locked onto his, hollow and haunting. He stumbled backward, tripping over a root and falling hard onto the cold, damp ground. As he scrambled to his feet, he heard a whisper right by his ear, close and rasping. "Stay with us." The figures advanced, their faces twisting with expressions of torment and longing, their hands reaching out. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in a cacophony of voices, each one pleading, "Help us. Don't leave us. We're lost. Join us." He backed away, his flashlight flickering, barely holding on to his composure. He turned and ran, weaving through the trees as the whispers chased him, growing louder and more desperate. The fog thickened around him, blurring his vision. The trees seemed to twist and reach out, snagging his clothes and scraping his skin as if trying to hold him back. Finally, he broke through the tree line, back onto the road. Gasping, he looked behind him, but the fog had closed in, obscuring the figures. The whispers faded, leaving only the oppressive silence. He made it to his cruiser, slamming the door shut and locking it, his heart pounding as he sat there, trying to calm his breathing. He looked up, and that's when he saw it, the driver from the abandoned car standing just outside the passenger window, his face pale and expressionless. The man raised one hand, pressing it against the glass, and whispered, "Don't go back." Then he vanished, dissolving into the mist, leaving only the faint outline of his handprint on the fogged-up window. Daniel hit the gas and sped away, not daring to look back. But even as he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him. In the days that followed, strange things began to happen. He'd hear faint whispers in his house, see shadows flicker in the corner of his vision, and sometimes, just before he fell asleep, he'd feel cold fingers brushing against his arm. No one ever found out what had happened to the people who went missing in the shallows. The town eventually blocked off the road, warning people to stay away. But Daniel knew the truth. They were still out there, lost in the mist, their souls trapped in that cursed place, calling out to anyone who dared enter. And sometimes, late at night, he'd hear them calling his name, a faint whisper carried on the wind. "Come back. Join us." It was supposed to be a routine welfare check. Officer Elena Vargas received a call about an elderly man named Harold Bishop who hadn't been seen by his neighbors in weeks. They worried that something had happened to him. Elena didn't think much of it. People sometimes liked their privacy, especially in the older neighborhoods. She drove out to Harold's address, an old ivy-covered house at the end of a narrow, dead-end street. The house had a strange air to it, as if time itself had slowed down around it. Weeds grew in tangled clumps along the walkway, and the windows looked dusty, almost smeared, as though someone had tried to wipe them clean but never finished. When she knocked on the door, it creaked open on its own, just a crack. "Mr. Bishop?" she called, but only silence answered. Stepping inside, Elena was hit by a thick, musky odor that made her stomach turn. It smelled of decay, dampness, and something faintly metallic. She called out again, her voice echoing through the dark, cluttered rooms. The house was filled with strange things. Old photos covered the walls, all in black and white. Each one seemed slightly off. Blurred faces, eyes looking away from the camera as though everyone in the pictures was uncomfortable or hiding. There were hundreds of them, all with the same eerie quality. She couldn't help but feel as though the eyes in the photos were watching her as she moved through the house. In the hallway, she noticed something that made her stop in her tracks. It was a doll, slumped against the wall, its glassy eyes wide open, staring at nothing. There was a whole row of them, each one in a different pose, each with a face that seemed almost aware. She shook off the uncomfortable feeling and continued down the hall, there it is, stepping around stacks of newspapers and empty bird cages, each one dangling from the ceiling like a strange mobile. As she moved deeper into the house, the musky smell grew stronger. She finally reached a room at the end of the hall, the bedroom. She pushed the door open slowly, her flashlight beam piercing the darkness. Harold Bishop was lying in bed, his body stiff and lifeless. He'd been dead for some time. But something was strange. His eyes were open, staring straight ahead with a look of abject horror on his face. His hand was outstretched as if reaching for something, frozen in a moment of terror. Elena moved closer, but something in the air made her skin crawl. The room was colder, and a strange sensation washed over her, a feeling of being watched. She glanced around and noticed that there were more photographs on the walls, but these were different. They weren't of people, they were of empty rooms, staircases, hallways. Each photograph showed a part of the house. She felt a chill run down her spine as she realized that some of these photographs showed this very room, including the bed she was standing next to. Her heart raced as her eyes landed on the last photo, a grainy black and white image of the bedroom door, open just a crack, as if someone had been peeking inside. As she turned back to Harold's body, she noticed something else, something small clutched in his hand. She carefully pried his fingers apart and found a crumpled photograph, yellowed with age. It was a picture of a young girl with long dark hair, dressed in an old-fashioned dress, her face blurred just like the others. On the back, written in shaky handwriting, were the words, "She watches." Elena's heart skipped a beat. She suddenly had the overwhelming urge to leave the room, to leave the house entirely. But as she turned to go, she heard a faint sound. It was soft, barely audible, like a whisper carried on a draft. "Elena." She froze. The voice was a whisper, distant and echoing, but unmistakable. It was her name. Slowly she turned, her flashlight sweeping across the room. But there was no one there. Just the rows of empty bird cages swinging slightly, casting long, thin shadows across the walls. As she backed out of the bedroom, she glanced down the hall and her breath caught. At the end of the hall, in the dim light, stood the figure of a young girl, the same girl from the photograph. She stood still, her head tilted to the side, her face obscured by shadows, but her eyes gleamed, catching the light in an unnatural way. "Elena." The voice was louder now, coming from the girl, though her lips didn't move. Panic took over, and Elena turned and bolted down the hall. As she reached the living room, her flashlight flickered, and the house itself seemed to shudder, the walls creaking as if alive. She ran for the front door, but it slammed shut before she could reach it. She grabbed the handle, yanking and pulling, but it wouldn't budge. Behind her, the girl's voice echoed again, but now there was a chorus of whispers joining it, each voice saying her name, overlapping, growing louder. She turned around, her back pressed against the door, and saw them, figures standing in the shadows, emerging from the walls, all of them watching her with hollow eyes. Elena, 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 they chanted, their voices rising. The dolls from the hallway seemed to come to life, their heads turning to face her, each one whispering her name with cracked porcelain lips. The bird cages above her began to sway and rattle as if something was trapped inside, trying to get out. Finally, with one last desperate effort, Elena threw her shoulder against the door. It burst open, and she stumbled outside, gasping for air as she stumbled down the steps, nearly tripping over her own feet. She didn't look back until she reached her patrol car. When she glanced up at the house, she saw them again. Dozens of faces pressed up against the windows, watching her with those empty, haunted eyes. In the center, the young girl stood, her face still blurred, her head tilted, one hand lifted as if waving goodbye. She didn't stay to watch any longer. She jumped into her car and sped away, her heart pounding as she put as much distance between herself and that house as she could. But the voices stayed with her, even after she returned to the station. For weeks after, Elena was haunted. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those faces, the girl's hand reaching out, and she heard the whisper of her name echoing in her mind. She started seeing shadows move in her apartment, feeling cold spots that sent chills down her spine. Every night, as she tried to sleep, she would hear the faintest sound, a soft, persistent whisper right next to her ear. Elena, she watches. The house was condemned and eventually demolished, but Elena could never shake the feeling that the spirits hadn't left. They were attached to her now, following her wherever she went, and every so often, when she passed by a mirror or glanced over her shoulder, she would catch a glimpse of a young girl standing just behind her, watching. In a sleepy, isolated town, Officer Mark Hansen was called to investigate an abandoned farmhouse where strange noises had been reported. Locals said the place was cursed, but as a practical man, Mark thought the stories were just small-town gossip. As he approached the property, the fog rolled in thick and heavy, wrapping around the house like a shroud. The farmhouse loomed out of the mist, silent and dark, with windows that looked like hollow eyes. Mark approached the front door and knocked, though he already knew no one would answer. The house had been vacant for over 30 years, left to rot after the family that once lived there had vanished. Neighbors said they'd simply disappeared one night, their dinner plates still on the table, their coats hanging by the door. No trace of them was ever found. The door creaked open, and Mark stepped inside. The air was stale, carrying a faint smell of old wood, dust, and something sour like rotting fruit. The silence was unnerving. The whole place felt like a ghost, frozen in time. As he walked through the entryway, he noticed family photos on the walls, faded and sepia-toned. A mother, father, 2 children. Their faces were oddly blurred in every photo, as though the camera had struggled to capture their features. He moved deeper into the house, feeling the oppressive quiet press down on him. Then he heard it, a faint, soft giggle echoing from somewhere upstairs. It sounded like a child, and it sent a shiver down his spine. He called out, but his voice seemed to disappear into the silence. His instincts told him to turn back, but he forced himself to keep going. The stairs creaked as he climbed, each step slow and deliberate. At the top, the hallway stretched out before him, lined with doors. He could feel the air grow colder as he moved forward, but the giggle turning into a soft whisper that he couldn't quite make out. It was as if the house was breathing, alive with an energy he couldn't see. Mark reached a door at the end of the hall that was slightly ajar. As he pushed it open, his flashlight flickered, casting shadows across the room. He found himself in a child's bedroom, untouched since the family had disappeared. The bed was made, toys scattered across the floor, and a dollhouse sat in one corner, its tiny furniture arranged neatly inside. Suddenly, he noticed something out of place. In the corner of the room stood a figure, small and frail, a little girl with long, dark hair, dressed in a white nightgown. Her back was to him, and she was humming softly, a haunting melody that seemed to vibrate through the walls. "Hello?" he called out, but the girl didn't turn. She kept humming, her shoulders swaying slightly to the eerie tune. Mark stepped closer, feeling the hairs on the back of his neck rise. When he was just a few feet away, she finally stopped humming. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, slowly, she began to turn around. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and dark with a strange gleam to them. Her lips were curved into a small, unsettling smile, and her skin looked almost translucent, like she was barely there. She stared at him, unblinking. "Are you lost?" he managed to ask, though his voice came out in a shaky whisper. The girl's smile widened, but she said nothing. Instead, she lifted her hand and pointed behind him. Mark turned around, his heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just the empty hallway, stretching back toward the stairs. When he looked back at the girl, she was gone. The room was empty, the air thick with an eerie stillness. His flashlight flickered again, and he swore he could feel something cold brushing against his arm. Shaken, he backed out of the room, his gaze darting around as he made his way down the hall. The whispering had started again, but now it was louder, filling the house with a low, rhythmic chant that seemed to echo off the walls. The words were garbled, indecipherable, but they sounded like they were coming from every room, every corner. As he descended the stairs, he noticed something strange. The family photos on the wall had changed. The mother and father were no longer in the pictures. Instead, they were replaced by the little girl, her dark eyes staring out at him from each frame, her smile growing wider in every picture. In one, she had her hands pressed against the glass, as if trying to break through. Mark's pulse quickened, and he broke into a run, his boots pounding against the floorboards as he made his way to the front door. Just as he reached it, he felt a cold hand grip his shoulder, stopping him in his tracks. He spun around, but there was no one there. The chanting was louder now, echoing through his mind, filling him with a dread so intense he could barely breathe. He yanked the door open and stumbled outside, gasping for air. The fog had thickened, swallowing the house in a dense gray haze. As he looked back, he saw a shadow standing in the doorway, a tall, dark figure, watching him with hollow eyes that seemed to burn in the darkness. And behind it, the little girl appeared, her face twisted into a look of pure malice. She raised her hand, and though she was too far away for him to hear, he could see her mouth moving, forming one word: "Stay." Mark didn't wait. He sprinted to his car, the fog seeming to close in around him as he jumped in and slammed the door. His hands shook as he fumbled with the keys, and the engine roared to life. As he sped away, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them, the girl and the dark figure, standing side by side in the middle of the road, watching him disappear into the night. But even as he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The whispering followed him, echoing in his ears, filling his mind. And when he finally got home, he found a photograph lying on the passenger seat, one he hadn't seen before. It was a picture of the farmhouse taken from the outside, and there, standing in the window, was the little girl, her dark eyes fixed on him, her mouth open in a silent scream. Every night after that, he would hear her voice in his dreams, calling out to him, begging him to return. And sometimes, late at night, he would catch a glimpse of her reflection in his mirrors, her dark eyes watching him, her smile growing wider and wider. And he knew that, one day, she would come for him. Officer Julie Carter had worked in the small town for nearly a decade. But there was one call she would never forget. The night she was sent to check on the old Rosewood Asylum, an abandoned mental hospital on the outskirts of town. Kids often dared each other to sneak into Rosewood, but they never stayed long. There were rumors of strange sounds, flickering lights, and shadows that moved on their own. On a quiet night, a frantic call came in from a group of teenagers who claimed that their friend had gone missing inside Rosewood. They'd been exploring the building, daring each other to go down into the basement when their friend Alex ran ahead, laughing. Moments later, they heard him scream, followed by the slam of a heavy door. Then, nothing. They couldn't find him anywhere. Julie arrived at the asylum, the huge, decaying structure looming in the moonlight. It was a sprawling, eerie building with broken windows and ivy creeping up its walls. The whole place seemed to radiate darkness, like it was swallowing up any light that dared touch it. Julie shivered as she stepped out of her car, hearing nothing but the sound of the wind whispering through the broken windows. She met the teenagers at the entrance, their faces pale and wide-eyed. They pleaded with her to go find Alex, claiming they'd heard footsteps and voices echoing through the halls. But when they tried to reach the basement, the air had grown thick, the temperature plummeting. Terrified, they'd run back outside. Against her better judgment, Julie decided to go in alone. She couldn't ignore the feeling of unease creeping over her as she entered the asylum, her flashlight casting long, eerie shadows across the cracked walls and rusted metal fixtures. The air was heavy, filled with the scent of mildew and something sour, and every sound seemed amplified in the silence. The main hall was covered in graffiti, and remnants of old medical equipment lay scattered on the floor, an old wheelchair here, an overturned gurney there, all cloaked in a thick layer of dust. As she moved further inside, the silence was broken by faint sounds. A distant hum, the creak of something moving, and what sounded like footsteps echoing down the hall. "Alex?" she called out, but her voice was swallowed by the vast emptiness. Following the teenager's instructions, she made her way down the stairs toward the basement. The further she went, the colder it became. Her breath misted in the frigid air, and her flashlight flickered slightly, casting strange shadows on the walls. She kept hearing whispers, soft and garbled, coming from somewhere below. At the bottom of the stairs, she entered a long, narrow hallway. The walls were lined with doors, like each one leading to small, cramped cells where patients had once been held. Some doors were missing entirely, others hung open, revealing tiny rooms with rotting cots and faded graffiti scratched into the walls. Then she saw it, a dark smear on the floor, leading down the hall. It looked like a trail, as if something had been dragged. She followed it, her pulse quickening with each step. The whispers grew louder, though they were still too faint to make out any words. They seemed to surround her, echoing from every direction. At the end of the hall, she found a large metal door, slightly ajar. Her flashlight flickered again as she pushed it open, the sound of rusty hinges echoing down the corridor. The room beyond was pitch black, and the smell hit her immediately, a pungent, metallic odor that made her gag. She could feel something watching her, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. "Alex," she whispered, her voice barely audible. A quiet, shuffling sound answered her from the darkness, followed by a low, raspy breathing. Her flashlight beam caught a glimpse of something in the corner, huddled on the floor. She moved closer, her heart pounding as she strained to see. It was Alex. He was sitting with his knees drawn up, rocking back and forth, his eyes wide and glazed, staring at something only he could see. "Alex," she whispered, relieved. "Are you okay?" He didn't respond. His lips moved, forming silent words, and she leaned in closer, trying to hear. Then he stopped rocking, his body going completely still, and he slowly turned his head to look at her. His eyes were hollow, unfocused, and there was something deeply unsettling about his gaze. "They told me," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Julie's blood ran cold. "Who told you, Alex?" He pointed to the shadows at the far end of the room. She turned, her flashlight sweeping over the dark space, but there was nothing there. The light flickered again, and that's when she saw it. Just for a split second, like a flash of memory. A figure, gaunt and twisted, standing in the corner, its face obscured by darkness. It was watching her, eyes glinting in the dim light. Then the flashlight went out completely, plunging them into darkness. Julie's heart raced as she smacked the flashlight, desperately trying to bring it back to life. She could hear Alex's breathing grow ragged, and his voice began to tremble as he whispered, "They want me to stay. They want me to join them." The light flickered back on, and she saw him staring at her with a look of pure terror. He grabbed her arm, his grip cold and clammy. "We have to go," he whispered urgently. "They don't like it when people leave." Julie nodded, pulling him to his feet as she backed toward the door. But as they reached the hallway, she felt a cold hand graze her shoulder, and a voice whispered in her ear, soft and taunting, "Stay with us." She turned, her flashlight catching another glimpse of a figure standing in the shadows, a faint, twisted smile on its face. Alex whimpered, his eyes wide with terror as he looked down the hall. "They're everywhere," he choked out. "They're all around us." Julie didn't wait to see what he meant. She pulled him up the stairs, their footsteps echoing as they ran, her mind filled with the faint whispers that seemed to chase them. The halls grew darker, the temperature dropping further with every step. She could feel their presence, closing in, watching her, trying to pull her back. Finally, they burst through the front doors, and into the cold night air. They didn't stop running until they were halfway down the driveway, both gasping for breath. When she looked back, the asylum loomed in the fog, silent and still. But in one of the broken windows, she could swear she saw a figure watching them, just a shadow with eyes that gleamed in the darkness. They never found out who or what was inside Rosewood Asylum that night. The teenagers left town, too traumatized to speak of it again. Alex moved away shortly after, but Julie knew he was never the same. He'd tell her about the nightmares he had, of cold, pale faces staring out from the darkness, whispering his name, calling him back. And Julie? She'd wake up some nights to the faint, ghostly sound of whispers in her own home, always drifting from the corners of the room, too soft to make out. But she could swear just barely that they were saying her name. One evening, Officer Sarah Trent was sent to investigate a disturbance at a house on the edge of town. Neighbors had reported hearing screams and seeing flickering lights, but when Sarah arrived, the house was silent. The home was a large Victorian, weather-beaten and overgrown with ivy, casting long shadows in the dim light. The front door was slightly open, swaying gently in the night breeze. She called out, announcing herself, but no one responded. Hesitating only for a moment, Sarah stepped inside. The house smelled old and stale, like it hadn't been lived in for years, though she knew it was occupied just that morning. She flicked on her flashlight, illuminating a long hallway lined with cracked mirrors and fading wallpaper. As she moved deeper into the house, she noticed something odd. Each mirror reflected not just her own face, but others as well. Faces in the background, shadowed and indistinct, as though people were standing behind her, watching. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck prick up but push the feeling aside. It was an old house, full of tricks and creaks. She entered the living room, where the furniture was arranged neatly, though every surface was covered in a fine layer of dust. In the corner, there was a record player, the kind with a hand crank. She glanced at it briefly, but as she turned to leave, the record player started up on its own. A haunting, scratchy melody filled the room, a soft, echoing tune that sounded as though it were coming from far away. Sarah froze, watching as the record spun slowly, playing a song that made her skin crawl. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was thick and unnatural, and she felt as though the house were holding its breath. Then came the footsteps. From upstairs, she heard the soft, measured steps of someone moving down the hall, directly above her. She tried calling out again, but her voice came out weak and hollow. The footsteps stopped, and she felt the ceiling above her vibrate, like something heavy had just been dropped. Her instincts told her to leave, but duty pulled her toward the staircase. Slowly, she climbed the creaking steps, each one seeming louder than the last. At the top of the stairs was a long, narrow hallway, lined with closed doors. The air up here was colder, and her breath fogged in the dim light. She felt an intense pressure, as though she were intruding on something ancient and angry. One of the doors at the end of the hall was slightly open, and a faint light glowed from inside. She made her way toward it, her hand resting on her flashlight, gripping it tightly. As she reached the door, she felt a chill spread through her body, as though someone had just walked through her. Pushing the door open, she found herself in what appeared to be a bedroom. The furniture was sparse, a bed, a small dresser, and a chair facing the window. But what caught her attention was the writing on the walls. Words were scrawled everywhere in black ink, covering every inch of space. Leave. She watches. Don't look back. It comes for you. Her heart pounded as she read the warnings, each word filling her with a growing sense of dread. She turned to leave, but stopped when she noticed something in the corner. A figure, small and hunched, facing the wall. It looked like a young woman, her long, tangled hair falling over her face, her back arched unnaturally. Sarah felt her blood run cold. She took a slow, shaky step back, her instincts screaming at her to get out. But then the figure moved, turning its head slightly, just enough for Sarah to see one eye wide and filled with a mixture of fear and malice. "She doesn't want you here," the figure whispered, her voice soft and broken. Sarah stumbled back, her flashlight flickering as she hurried toward the door. But before she could reach it, the figure let out a scream. A high, shrill wail that pierced her ears and sent a wave of terror through her. The room seemed to darken, shadows gathering around her, pressing in. She bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind her, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. As she ran down the hallway, she heard the sound of something dragging behind her, a low scraping noise that seemed to grow louder with each step. She dared not look back, the warnings from the walls repeating in her mind, "Don't look back." She flew down the stairs, nearly stumbling as she reached the bottom. The house was colder now, the air thick and heavy, and she felt as though invisible hands were reaching for her, trying to pull her back. She dashed for the front door, her hand grasping the knob just as the record player started up again, that same eerie, scratchy tune filling the silence. As she pulled the door open, she heard a voice, soft and chilling, coming from right behind her. "You'll come back. They always come back." Sarah slammed the door behind her, sprinting to her car. She didn't look back at the house until she was safely inside, her hands shaking as she started the engine. Through the windshield, she saw a shadow in the window, a figure watching her, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its eyes dark and endless. She drove away, the image burned into her mind, the voice echoing in her ears. That night she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the writing on the walls, the figures in the mirrors, the girl's single, haunting eye. Weeks later, she learned the history of the house. It had once been a home for girls who were troubled, though many had mysteriously disappeared over the years. People said the house had a way of keeping what it wanted, drawing in lost souls who couldn't resist its call. And every so often, when Sarah was alone, she would hear that faint, scratchy melody, playing just beyond her hearing, reminding her that the house was still waiting, still watching. Officer Tom Mendez was used to strange calls. Small towns had their quirks, especially at night. But the call about the bridge always sent a chill through him. It was an old iron structure spanning a narrow river, overgrown with vines and hidden from view by a dense thicket. Local legend had it that people saw things out there, figures that shouldn't exist, voices that called to them from the water below. Most officers brushed it off, but the stories were persistent enough that people rarely went near it, especially after dark. That night, he got a call from a woman named Lila, who was sobbing hysterically. Her boyfriend, Sam, had driven out to the bridge on a dare and hadn't come back. She said she could still hear his voice on her phone, faint and garbled, whispering, calling her name, but the connection had broken off. Tom agreed to meet her near the bridge and investigate. Lila's face was pale as she told him about Sam's fascination with the bridge and the strange things he had been saying in the days leading up to his disappearance. When Tom reached the bridge, he found it draped in shadows, only partially visible in his headlights. It was old and rusted, with twisted metal railings and gaps in the walkway that revealed the dark water below. He had heard the stories himself over the years, people seeing themselves standing on the opposite sides staring back, others hearing voices calling them by name. But no one ever had solid proof, only stories passed down through generations. Lila begged him to go look for Sam. Reluctantly, Tom stepped onto the bridge, his flashlight casting a thin beam through the thick fog that clung to the river. The air was heavy, damp, and the silence was broken only by the faint sounds of water moving below and his footsteps echoing off the iron. As he walked, he noticed something strange, whispers, too faint to make out. At first, he thought it was his imagination, the nerves of being alone on the bridge getting to him. But then he heard it again, soft, beckoning, his name drifting through the mist. Tom. He froze, his grip tightening on his flashlight. The voice was familiar, soft and warm, and for a moment, he thought he recognized it as his sister's voice, though she'd passed away years ago. He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts, but the voice grew louder, more insistent. "Come closer, Tom." He forced himself to move forward, one step at a time, his eyes scanning the bridge. That's when he saw it. A figure standing on the far end, barely visible through the fog. It looked like a man, but the way he stood, so still and motionless, sent a shiver down Tom's spine. "Sam?" He called out, but the figure didn't respond. It simply watched him, its head tilted slightly to the side. Tom took a cautious step forward, and the figure moved back in sync, keeping the same distance between them. Tom's heart pounded as he edged closer, unable to shake the feeling that he was being drawn in. As he neared the middle of the bridge, he noticed something chilling. The figure looked exactly like him. His same face, his same uniform, his same expression of dread. But the eyes were wrong. Dark, empty, like twin voids. The figure spoke, its voice identical to Tom's own. Come with me. You don't belong here. Tom stumbled back, the words echoing in his mind. He could hear the whispers again, growing louder, like hundreds of voices calling his name, urging him to come closer. He felt the bridge shudder beneath him, and a gust of wind swept through, icy and sharp, carrying with it the scent of decay and something foul, like stagnant water. He tried to turn around, to go back to Leela, but he felt an invisible pull, a force dragging him toward the dark water below. He clutched the railing, his knuckles white, but the pull grew stronger. The whispers were all around him now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to rise from the depths of the river itself. Then he saw them, faces, twisted and hollow, emerging from the water, their eyes wide and staring, mouths open in silent screams. They looked like people he'd known, people from town, people who disappeared over the years. They were reaching for him, their hands clawing at the air, as though desperate to pull him down into the murky depths. The figure on the other end of the bridge moved closer, and Tom's heart nearly stopped when he saw it smile. A cold, unnatural grin that stretched too wide, revealing teeth, sharp and glinting in the darkness. The figure raised a hand, beckoning him forward. "You can't leave," it whispered, its voice filled with malice. "You're already one of us." Panic surged through him as he fought to pull away, his mind racing. He forced himself to look away from the figure, focusing on the end of the bridge where he could barely make out the faint silhouette of Lila, waiting for him. The whispers grew louder, angry now, as though they could sense his defiance. "Don't leave Tom," they chanted. "Stay with us." With every ounce of strength, he broke free from the invisible pull and stumbled back, nearly falling as he reached the other end of the bridge. As he looked back one last time, he saw the figure watching him, its smile fading, its face contorting in rage. The faces in the water faded, one by one, sinking back into the depths, their eyes still locked on him. He staggered back to the road, where Lila rushed to him, her face filled with relief and fear. He couldn't bring himself to speak, and they drove back in silence, the whispers still lingering in his mind, fading with each mile they put between themselves and the bridge. Years passed, but Tom was never the same. He refused to speak of what he'd seen that night. The image of his own twisted face watching him still haunting his dreams. And sometimes in the dead of night, he would hear it again, that voice, calling to him from somewhere far away, reminding him that one day the bridge would call him back. And next time it wouldn't let him go. Detective Lisa Hart had been called to investigate a series of disappearances in an isolated part of the county. All the victims had last been seen driving down Ridgewood Road, a narrow, winding path through thick woods. There were rumors about that road, stories that locals whispered, sightings of strange figures in the trees, shadows that shouldn't be there, and, most unsettling, people who simply vanished without a trace. On a late autumn night, Lisa decided to drive down Ridgewood herself, trying to understand what had happened to those who had disappeared. As she turned onto the road, a heavy fog settled in, cloaking the trees in a ghostly white haze. The headlights barely pierced the fog, and the air felt thick and unnaturally cold. The branches of the trees arched overhead, forming a dark tunnel, blocking out what little light the moon offered. She could feel an uneasy tension building in her chest, but she pressed on. A few miles in, her car radio crackled to life with static. She hadn't turned it on, and the noise startled her. The static grew louder, then shifted to a faint, rhythmic sound. A voice, distorted and whispering, too garbled to understand, but definitely saying something. She fiddled with the dial, trying to turn it off, but it wouldn't stop. The voice grew louder, filling the car, and she thought she could make out a single word repeating over and over, "Turn around! Turn around!" She slowed the car, feeling an irrational urge to listen, to obey. But she steeled herself and kept driving, determined to reach the end of Ridgewood Road. As she drove deeper into the forest, the fog seemed to thicken, and strange shadows flitted just beyond her headlights. She tried to tell herself it was just animals, but something about the way the shadows moved made her skin crawl. It was almost as if they were following her, darting through the trees, keeping pace with her car. Then in the corner of her eye, she saw a figure standing on the edge of the road, a tall, thin silhouette, barely visible in the mist. She slammed on the brakes, her heart racing. The figure didn't move, didn't even flinch. It was just standing there, watching her. She couldn't make out its face, but she could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, sending a shiver down her spine. She waited, her hand hovering over the gear shift, ready to reverse. But after a few seconds, the figure vanished, as though it had dissolved back into the fog. Shaken, Lisa continued driving, but now her every sense was on high alert. She kept glancing in her mirrors, half expecting to see the figure again. The radio had fallen silent, but the car was filled with an eerie quiet, broken only by the faint hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. Another few minutes passed, and then she saw it again. This time, the figure was directly in the middle of the road, closer than before. She could see more details now. A man dressed in ragged clothes, his head hanging low, his hair matted and wild. His arms hung at his sides, limp, and his fingers were curled like claws. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The man lifted his head slowly, and she saw his face, pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. His mouth was twisted into a crooked smile, one that sent a wave of nausea through her. He took a slow step forward, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being dragged by invisible strings. Lisa gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white. She wasn't sure if she should drive forward or reverse. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but her body felt frozen, her gaze locked onto the man's hollow eyes. Then, without warning, he let out a low, guttural laugh, a sound that echoed through the fog, filling the air with a sickening resonance. She finally snapped out of her trance and floored the accelerator, speeding past him. In her rearview mirror, she saw him watching her go, his mouth stretched wide in that horrible smile, his eyes following her until he was swallowed by the mist. Her heart pounded as she continued down the road, her mind racing with questions. But then, as she rounded a bend, she saw him again, standing in the road ahead, just as before, his head tilted, his gaze fixed on her with an unnatural intensity. She swerved, her car nearly skidding off the road, and barely missed him. The man didn't even flinch, as though he were rooted to the spot. As she drove on, he kept appearing, always in the road just ahead, each time closer and closer, until she could see his face clearly, see the empty black voids where his eyes should have been. Lisa's mind raced, desperately trying to make sense of what was happening. She tried calling for backup, but her radio was filled with static, and her cell phone had no signal. She was alone, trapped on Ridgewood Road with a figure that defied all logic. Just as she felt the last threads of her sanity slipping, the fog lifted, revealing a clearing in the trees. Relief washed over her as she realized she was nearing the end of the road. She accelerated, eager to leave Ridgewood behind. But as she reached the clearing, she saw a sight that made her blood run cold. Her own car, headlights on, was parked in the middle of the road as though waiting for her. She hit the brakes, staring in disbelief. It was unmistakably her car, down to the smallest detail. The doors were open, and there in the driver's seat sat a figure slumped forward, unmoving. She knew it was impossible, but as she stared at the figure, she realized it looked just like her. She got out, her legs shaking as she approached the car, her flashlight held out like a weapon. She reached the driver's side and peered inside. The figure was indeed herself, her face pale, her eyes wide and vacant, staring into nothingness. Her lips were parted slightly as though caught in the middle of a scream. Lisa staggered back, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. Then she heard the laugh again, that same guttural, mocking laugh. She turned and saw him, the man with the hollow eyes, standing just a few feet away. He tilted his head, watching her with that terrible smile. "Welcome to the road," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. "You're one of us now." Lisa turned and ran, not looking back, the sound of his laughter echoing in her ears as she fled. She didn't stop running until she reached the highway, her car left abandoned on Ridgewood Road, her mind shattered by what she had seen. To this day, no one knows what happens on that stretch of Ridgewood Road or where the missing people go. But some nights, drivers report seeing a lone car parked by the side of the road, its headlights on, and inside, a figure slumped over the wheel, staring blankly into the darkness. And if they listen closely, they say they can hear a faint, chilling laugh echoing through the trees.